"Ma'am, we're going to need you to step aside." The words didn't come loud, but they cut through the quiet of the bank like something heavier than sound, something final, something that made people stop mid-sentence and turn without meaning to, and just like that, the soft hum of printers, the clicking of keyboards, the low murmur of financial transactions all slowed into a strange, suspended silence as Evelyn Carter stood at the counter, her hands resting gently on the polished marble. Fingers slightly curled as if they remembered a time when they steadied something more fragile than a withdrawal slip, and the young teller across from her avoided eye contact, her rehearsed smile gone, replaced by the tight discomfort of someone who had already decided what this moment meant without asking a single question, while behind her, the bank manager, Richard Coleman, stepped forward with the kind of calm authority that didn't need to raise its voice to take control. His shoes clicking sharply against the tile floor, each step measured, deliberate, as though the space itself belonged to him, and Evelyn didn't move, not yet, not when she felt the weight of every eye in the room slowly settling on her shoulders, not when she heard the faint rustle of someone shifting in line behind her, not when the air itself seemed to tighten around her presence like she had suddenly become something out of place, something that didn't belong in a room filled with glass walls, digital screens, and quiet wealth, her reflection faintly visible in the polished surface of the counter, silver hair neatly pulled back, coat worn but clean, eyes steady even as the moment pressed in around her, and for a second, just a second, she closed her eyes, drawing in a slow breath that carried the scent of paper, ink, and something colder, something harder to name, before opening them again with a calm that didn't match the situation unfolding around her. "I'm just trying to access my account," she said, her voice soft but clear, the kind of voice that had once soothed frightened patients in hospital rooms long after midnight, but Richard didn't respond to the tone, only to the situation as he had already decided it was, his expression composed, professional, distant, as if he were handling a minor disruption rather than a person. "We've reviewed the account, ma'am," he replied, his voice even, controlled, carrying just enough firmness to signal that this was no longer a conversation. "And there appears to be an issue that requires further verification." And the way he said, "issue," made it feel heavier than the word itself, like something unspoken had already filled in the blanks for everyone listening, a quiet assumption passing invisibly from one person to another, and somewhere near the back of the line, a man cleared his throat, not impatient, just aware. Just watching, as Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly against the marble, not in anger, not in fear, but in something steadier, something older, as if she had stood in moments like this before and learned that dignity wasn't something given, it was something held, even when the room tried to take it from you, and still, she didn't step aside, not when asked, not when expected, because something in her posture, in the quiet way she lifted her chin just slightly, said she understood exactly what was happening, and she refused to disappear into it. The silence did not break, it settled, heavier now, pressing into the polished floor and the tall glass windows that reflected a world outside where people walked freely without knowing what was unfolding inside, and Evelyn Carter remained where she stood, her posture unchanged, her presence quiet but immovable, as if she had anchored herself to something deeper than the moment, something that could not be shaken by suspicion or impatience. And for a brief second, the light from the afternoon sun shifted across the marble counter, catching the fine lines on her hands, tracing the faint network of veins beneath her skin, hands that had once worked 12-hour shifts in a county hospital, hands that had held trembling fingers, adjusted oxygen masks, and wiped tears from strangers who had no one else to sit beside them when the room grew too quiet. And those same hands now rested calmly in a place where no one knew what they had carried, where no one asked, where no one seemed to see. Beyond the surface of an elderly woman standing at the wrong end of a conversation she did not start, and somewhere in the back of her mind, memories moved like distant echoes, the steady beep of monitors, the scent of antiseptic, the low murmur of families waiting for answers, all of it blending into the present moment where the only sound now was the faint hum of the air conditioning vent above, cool and constant, indifferent to the tension below, and Evelyn exhaled slowly, not as surrender, but as control, the kind she had learned over decades, the kind that kept her voice steady even when the world around her tried to rush her into silence. There must be a mistake, she said again, not louder, not sharper, just clearer, her eyes lifting to meet Richard Coleman's without hesitation, and there was something in that look that did not match the role he had already placed her in, something grounded, something certain. But Richard did not pause long enough to reconsider, his training, his assumptions, his sense of order already guiding him forward. "Ma'am, we have procedures for situations like this," he replied, his tone unchanged, professional in a way that left no room for empathy, and the word procedures seemed to hang in the air like a wall being built between them, invisible but firm, and behind him, a security guard shifted his weight slightly, not yet moving, but close enough to signal that the next step was already being prepared, and Evelyn noticed, of course she did, but she did not step back, she did not raise her voice, she did not plead. Because somewhere between the years she had spent caring for others and the quiet life she now lived alone in a small one-bedroom apartment on the east side of town, she had learned that dignity was not something you asked for, it was something you held on to, even when no one offered it to you, and the young teller glanced up again, just for a moment, her eyes flickering with something uncertain, something that almost looked like doubt, but it passed quickly, replaced by the same quiet compliance that filled the rest of the room. And Evelyn felt it, the way a space could decide who you were without knowing your name. The way silence could become agreement, and still, she remained steady. Present, refusing to let the moment define her, even as it tried to close in around her. Richard Coleman adjusted his cuff slightly, a small, almost unconscious movement, but one that carried the weight of someone who believed the situation was already under control, his posture straight, shoulders squared, the quiet confidence of authority settling over him like a tailored suit, and as he glanced briefly at the monitor beside the teller, the reflection of numbers and account fields flickered across his glasses, cold and precise, reducing a lifetime of work into rows of data that either confirmed or denied legitimacy. And in that space, that narrow frame of information, Evelyn Carter had already been categorized, already been measured, and quietly, without announcement, already been found lacking, and the bank itself seemed to echo that judgment, the high ceilings amplifying every small sound, the soft footsteps of customers shifting in line, the distant ring of a phone unanswered, the mechanical hum of machines processing transactions worth more than most people in the room would ever see in a single year. And yet none of that movement touched her, none of it acknowledged her presence beyond the disruption she now represented, and Richard's voice returned. Steady, composed, carrying just enough finality to move things forward. "We cannot proceed with the withdrawal at this time," he said, not harsh, not loud, but definitive, the kind of tone that closed doors without needing to slam them, and the words landed in the space between them, firm and unyielding, as if they had always been waiting to be said, and Evelyn listened, really listened, not just to the words but to what sat behind them, the assumption, the quiet dismissal, the absence of curiosity, and she felt it then, not as anger, but as clarity, the kind that comes when a moment reveals exactly what it is, without disguise, without apology, and she straightened just slightly, not enough to challenge, just enough to remain fully present, her coat shifting softly against her shoulders, the fabric worn from years of careful use, but still held with care, still chosen with intention, and for a brief moment, her gaze drifted past Richard, across the bank, taking in the rows of waiting customers, the polished counters, the bright digital screens flashing interest rates and investment opportunities, promises of growth, of security, of belonging to those who fit within the system's expectations, and then her eyes returned to him, steady, unwavering. "That is my account," she said, her voice calm, each word placed with quiet precision, not rushed, not defensive, just true, and something in the way she said it created a small pause, almost imperceptible, a fraction of a second, where the air shifted, where the certainty in the room wavered just enough to be felt, but not enough to be acknowledged, and Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in resistance, the reflex of someone unaccustomed to being questioned in his own domain, and behind him, the security guard took a step closer, not aggressive, just present, the silent reinforcement of authority, and still, Evelyn did not move. Because in her mind, this was no longer about the transaction, no longer about the numbers on a screen. It was about something older, something deeper, something that could not be verified by identification or balance. And as the seconds stretched, the room held its breath again, waiting, watching, deciding without speaking who would yield first, and Evelyn Carter, with nothing but quiet dignity and a lifetime of unseen strength, chose not to. The air shifted again, not louder, not sharper, but tighter, like something invisible had drawn a line across the floor between them, and Evelyn Carter felt it without needing to look down, felt the way the space had begun to close ranks around Richard Coleman, around the quiet authority he carried, reinforced now by the subtle presence of the security guard standing just within reach, close enough to act, far enough to remain unspoken, and for a moment, just a moment, Evelyn's fingers lifted from the marble counter, hovering slightly as if deciding whether to step back, whether to release the ground she had held so calmly until now, but instead, she reached into her handbag, the motion slow, deliberate, not defensive, not rushed, the soft sound of the zipper parting barely audible beneath the silence of the room, and from inside, she withdrew a worn leather wallet, its edges softened by years of use. The surface marked by time but carefully kept, and she opened it with steady hands, revealing a neatly arranged set of documents, identification, bank statements, the quiet proof of a life lived responsibly, consistently, without spectacle, and she placed them gently on the counter, aligning them with care, as if the act itself carried meaning beyond the paper. "Everything you need is right here," she said, her voice even, not pleading, not challenging, just offering truth in its simplest form, and for a second, the young teller hesitated, her eyes flickering between the documents and Richard, uncertainty passing across her face like a shadow she did not fully understand, but Richard did not step forward to examine them, not immediately. His gaze remained fixed on Evelyn, assessing, measuring, holding on to the narrative he had already built, and the pause stretched, long enough for it to be noticed, long enough for it to matter, and behind them, a man in a tailored suit shifted his weight, glancing at his watch, not impatient with Evelyn, but with the delay itself, as if time, in this place, had a hierarchy too, and Evelyn saw it all, the subtle movements, the quiet judgments, the way a room could decide without speaking, and still, she did not raise her voice, did not demand attention, because something deeper guided her now, something that had nothing to do with proving herself and everything to do with standing in truth, and when Richard finally glanced down at the documents, it was brief, almost reluctant, as if acknowledging them would mean acknowledging something else he was not ready to face. "We will need to verify these," he said, the words careful, controlled, but no longer as absolute as before, and Evelyn nodded once, not in submission, but in understanding, because she knew what verification meant in a place like this. She knew it was not always about the information, but about who was believed, and who was not, and the light from the windows shifted again, stretching across the counter, illuminating the papers she had laid down, turning them from ordinary objects into something almost symbolic, proof not just of identity, but of existence, of history, of a life that deserved to be seen, and as the seconds passed, the silence returned, heavier now, filled with something unspoken, something waiting just beneath the surface, as if the moment itself was preparing to reveal what it had been building toward all along. The moment did not explode, it tightened, pulling every quiet detail into sharper focus as Richard Coleman reached for the documents at last, his fingers brushing the edge of the worn leather wallet before lifting the identification with a measured, almost reluctant precision, and the subtle shift in his posture did not go unnoticed, not by the teller, not by the man waiting in line, and certainly not by Evelyn Carter, who watched without expression, her calm unwavering even as the room seemed to lean forward collectively, waiting for something to confirm what they had already assumed. And Richard's eyes scanned the information quickly at first, then slower, his gaze lingering just a fraction longer than before, not enough to reveal doubt, but enough to interrupt the rhythm of certainty he had carried into the moment, and still, he said nothing, his lips pressing into a thin line as he placed the card down beside the statements, his attention shifting between the documents and the screen behind the counter, numbers flickering, accounts loading, data aligning in ways that did not match the narrative he had constructed, and the pause that followed stretched wider now, no longer invisible, no longer dismissible, and somewhere behind Evelyn, a quiet whisper moved through the line, not words exactly, but a change in tone, a subtle rebalancing of perception, and the security guard, who had stood ready only seconds ago, eased his stance slightly, the tension in his shoulders loosening just enough to signal that the situation was no longer as clear as it once appeared, and Richard inhaled slowly, his chest rising beneath the crisp fabric of his suit, as if recalibrating, as if deciding whether to hold on to the authority he had already asserted or adjust to the truth unfolding in front of him. And Evelyn remained still, her hands now resting lightly at her sides, no longer pressed against the counter, not in retreat, but in quiet confidence, as though she had already moved beyond the need to prove anything. Because the moment itself was beginning to speak for her, and when Richard finally looked up again, there was something different in his eyes, not apology, not yet, but the absence of certainty, the first crack in a judgment formed too quickly, and his voice, when it came, was still controlled, still professional, but no longer absolute. "There appears to be a discrepancy in our system," he said, choosing each word carefully, as if trying to reshape the situation without acknowledging how it had been handled, and the word discrepancy hung in the air like a fragile bridge between error and accountability, and Evelyn heard it, understood it, but did not respond immediately, because she knew that what had happened was not about a system, not entirely, and the room, once so certain in its silent agreement, now shifted again, attention redistributing, assumptions unraveling. And for the first time since the moment began, the power in the space no longer sat solely behind the counter, it hovered, unsettled, searching for where it truly belonged, while Evelyn Carter, with nothing raised, nothing forced, stood at the center of it, unchanged. No one spoke right away, and that absence of sound stretched longer than it should have, longer than anyone in the room was comfortable with, as if the space itself needed time to adjust to what had just shifted, and Evelyn Carter stood there, not triumphant, not relieved, simply present, her breathing slow and even, her gaze steady but no longer fixed on Richard Coleman, because the moment had moved beyond him now. Beyond the counter, beyond the narrow frame of authority that had tried to contain her, and the light from the tall windows softened as a cloud passed overhead, dimming the sharp reflections on the marble and turning the room into something quieter, something more honest, and in that softened light, the details became clearer, the faint tremor in Evelyn's fingers as they rested at her sides, not from fear, but from age, from years lived fully, from weight carried and released over time. The subtle rise and fall of her shoulders as she took another slow breath, grounding herself not in the outcome, but in her own presence, and behind the counter, Richard shifted again, his movements less certain now, less rehearsed, his hand hovering over the keyboard as if unsure whether to continue typing or to stop altogether, and the teller beside him watched in silence, her earlier confidence replaced by a quiet awareness that something important had just unfolded. Something that could not be undone with a simple correction on a screen, and the security guard stepped back, just half a step, but enough to create space where there had been pressure only moments before, and that small movement echoed louder than any words, because it signaled a change not just in action, but in understanding, and still, Evelyn did not speak, because she did not need to fill the silence, she allowed it to exist, allowed it to settle over the room like a mirror, reflecting back what had happened without explanation, without justification, and in that silence something else emerged, something quieter but stronger than tension, a kind of recognition that moved through the people watching, subtle but undeniable, as if they were beginning to see her not as a disruption, not as a question, but as a person they had overlooked only moments before, and Evelyn felt it, not as validation, but as a shift in weight, a balance correcting itself slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably, and she closed her eyes for just a second, drawing in a breath that carried none of the earlier tightness, only air, simple and steady, and when she opened them again, her expression had not changed, still calm, still composed, but there was something deeper now. Something rooted, as if she had already moved past the need for resolution, because dignity, once held, did not depend on acknowledgement, and as the quiet stretched on, it became clear that whatever would come next would not erase what had already been revealed, and that truth, more than anything spoken, filled the room. The silence held for one more breath, and then another, until it was broken not by urgency, but by something unexpected, the soft sound of the front door opening, letting in a slice of afternoon light and the distant noise of the street outside, a reminder that the world had not stopped, even if this room had, and a few heads turned instinctively, not out of curiosity at first, but out of habit. The way people always glance toward movement, and then the attention lingered, just a second longer than usual, as a tall figure stepped inside, his presence unforced yet unmistakable, not loud, not dramatic, but grounded, steady, and for a brief moment, no one spoke, as recognition moved quietly through the room, subtle at first, then undeniable, and Richard Coleman noticed it too, the shift in focus, the way the energy of the space redirected itself without a word, and he followed their gaze. His posture straightening again, but this time not from control, from awareness, and the man walked forward with an easy, measured pace, his eyes scanning the room not with judgment, but with attention, as if he were reading something beneath the surface, and then his gaze stopped, fixed not on the counter, not on the manager, but on Evelyn Carter, and something changed in his expression, something immediate and real, the kind of recognition that does not need explanation, and he slowed, just slightly, as he approached. The distance between them closing in quiet steps, and Evelyn noticed him. Of course she did, but she did not react the way others might have, no surprise, no sudden movement, only a calm turning of her head, her eyes meeting his with the same steady presence she had held from the beginning, and for a second, the room seemed to hold its breath again, but this time for a different reason, not tension, but anticipation, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, clear, carrying a weight that did not come from volume but from certainty. "Mrs. Carter," he said, and the use of her name landed softly but firmly, cutting through every assumption that had filled the room moments before, and Richard's expression shifted again, the last traces of certainty giving way to something closer to unease, because the narrative he had built no longer held, not in the presence of this new reality, and the man stepped closer, stopping just beside Evelyn, not in front of her, not above her, but beside her, equal, respectful. And there was a quiet pause before he continued, his eyes still on her, not asking permission, not seeking confirmation, but acknowledging something that already existed. "You probably do not remember me," he said, his tone steady, almost reflective. "But I remember you." And the words settled into the room with a different kind of weight, one that did not accuse, did not confront, but revealed, and for the first time since the moment began, the center of the story shifted completely, no longer about suspicion, no longer about verification, but about truth that had been unseen until now, and as the silence returned once more, it was no longer empty, it was full, waiting for what would come next. The room did not move, not yet, as the weight of his words settled into every corner, and Evelyn Carter looked at him carefully, her eyes narrowing just slightly, not in suspicion, but in memory, searching through years that had long since folded into one another, and for a moment, the distance between past and present seemed to blur, as if something forgotten was beginning to rise again, and the man gave a small nod, almost to himself, as if confirming what he already knew, before speaking. Again, his voice steady but softer now, carrying something personal beneath its calm surface. 12 years ago, St. Andrew's Medical Center, he said, and the name alone shifted something in Evelyn's expression, a flicker, subtle but unmistakable, and he continued, not rushing, not performing, simply stating what had been true long before this moment. "My mother came in late one night, she could barely breathe, everyone was overwhelmed, the waiting room was full, and no one had time." And the bank seemed to fade around him as he spoke, the polished counters, the glowing screens, all of it falling into the background as something more human took its place. "But you did," he said, looking at her now with a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. "You stayed with her, even after your shift ended, you sat beside her when she was scared, you kept talking to her when she could not respond, you made sure she was not alone." And the silence that followed was different now, deeper, filled not with tension, but with recognition, and Evelyn's breath caught just slightly, not from shock, but from the weight of a memory she had never expected to return, because to her, it had been one night among many, one patient among hundreds, one act of care that had never asked to be remembered, and yet here it was, standing in front of her, alive in someone else's voice, and the man exhaled slowly, his gaze softening. "She told me about you," he added. "She said there was a nurse who treated her like she mattered, even when everything felt like it was falling apart." And he paused, just long enough for the words to settle fully, before finishing. "That nurse was you." And the shift in the room was immediate, undeniable, as if something invisible had been turned inside out, the assumptions that had once filled the space now dissolving under the weight of truth, and Richard Coleman stood frozen behind the counter, his authority no longer anchored, his earlier certainty now exposed for what it had been, incomplete, and Evelyn did not step forward, did not react with pride or validation. She simply stood there, absorbing the moment with the same quiet dignity she had carried from the beginning, because what had been revealed was not something new to her, it was something she had always known, even when no one else saw it, and the man beside her gave a small, respectful nod, not elevating her, not rescuing her, but recognizing her, and in that simple acknowledgement, the entire balance of the room shifted, not through force, not through confrontation, but through truth that could no longer be ignored. No one rushed to speak after that, not even Richard Coleman, who stood behind the counter as if the ground beneath him had subtly shifted, his hands now resting still against the surface that had once defined his control, and the documents he had questioned moments ago lay quietly between them, unchanged, yet no longer carrying the same weight, and Evelyn Carter looked down at them briefly, not to reclaim them, not to prove anything further, but simply to acknowledge their presence before lifting her gaze again, calm as ever, untouched by the rise and fall of the room around her, and the man beside her stepped back half a pace, giving her space, not out of distance, but respect, as if understanding that whatever came next belonged to her alone, and for a long second, Evelyn said nothing, because she did not need to fill the silence with explanation or correction. The truth had already spoken in ways that words could not, and finally, she reached forward, gathering her documents. With the same careful precision she had shown before, aligning each piece, returning them to her wallet, her movements unhurried, steady, as though time itself had slowed to match her pace, and when she closed the wallet, the soft click echoed gently in the quiet, a small sound, but final in its own way, and Richard cleared his throat, the gesture subtle but unmistakable, his voice when it came no longer carrying the certainty it once had. "Mrs. Carter, I apologize for the inconvenience," he said, choosing his words carefully, as if trying to restore something that had already been revealed, and Evelyn paused, just for a moment, her hand resting lightly on her bag, her eyes meeting his, not harsh, not forgiving, simply present, and she nodded once, a small acknowledgement, not of the apology itself, but of the moment as a whole. "I only came to access what is mine," she said quietly, her voice steady, carrying no bitterness, no triumph, only truth, and that truth settled into the space between them more deeply than any apology could, and without another word she turned, her steps measured as she moved away from the counter, past the line of customers who now parted slightly without being asked, their earlier silence replaced by something softer, something closer to awareness, and the sunlight from the glass doors caught her as she walked, casting a gentle glow across her silver hair, her figure moving steadily toward the exit, and the man who had spoken for her watched in silence, his expression unchanged, not seeking recognition, not claiming credit, only witnessing, and Richard remained where he was, his reflection faint in the polished surface before him, a man who had just seen the limits of his own assumptions without anyone needing to say it aloud, and as the doors opened and Evelyn stepped outside, the light followed her, bright and unfiltered, while inside, the bank returned slowly to its rhythm, but not quite the same, because something had shifted, something quiet and undeniable, and in the space she left behind, there remained no anger, no confrontation. Only the lingering presence of dignity that had never needed permission to exist.